Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar on understanding the football transfer market. Thank you for being here tonight. Let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Diego Valdez, and I am the director at the Sports Business Institute Barcelona. For those of you that may not know who we are, we're an organization that specializes in education for the football industry. We specialize in courses on the business side of football, and we work with some of the top clubs, federations, and organizations in sport. And from time to time, we host these live webinars with special guests. And tonight, we are very honored to have Daniel Geey. Daniel is an international sports lawyer. He is a partner at Sheridan's law firm. And he's also the author of a new book entitled Done Deal, which looks at the business side of the football industry. It's an insider's look at the business side of the football industry, which just was recently published. And we're going to talk about his book in just a moment. But first, let's go ahead and test with Daniel and make sure that he can hear us and that he can connect with his audio. So Daniel, welcome. Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Hi there, Daniel. We can hear you very well now, so thank you for being here tonight.
It's an absolute pleasure, and the honour's all mine. It's great to be able to speak on football industry stuff, but just like all of us, I'm sure that are here, we're all football fans ultimately, so it's great to hear some questions, and it's super just to give everyone some of my insights that I've learned over the years.
Perfect. Well, we're looking forward to diving in. We can't see your camera, by the way, Daniel. I don't know if we can get your camera on, but if not, your sound is coming through perfectly, so that's absolutely fine. But while we do that and wait to see if we can get your video, I'm just going to run through some housekeeping details. There we go. Just going to run through some housekeeping details so everybody knows how we're going to run tonight. The webinar should last approximately 60 minutes. And the way we're going to structure it is, in just a moment, we're going to ask Daniel a few questions, and then we're going to open it up for you guys. So there will be a Q&A session at the end where you will be able to type your questions in the chat box, and you can ask Daniel anything you like about what we're going to be discussing tonight. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that if you want to participate in the conversation via social media, the hashtag we use is SBIDigi, so be sure to use the hashtag SBIDigi, and we have Emma from our team moderating the conversation on social media, so be sure to engage with us, particularly on Twitter. So, that's on the social media side of things. So, without further ado, Daniel, let's get started with tonight's discussion, because there's quite a few topics that I'm sure people want to hear more about. And one of the things that, perhaps we could begin our discussion with is a lot of the people that are listening tonight, I'm sure, want to know about how they can become an agent or an intermediary in the football industry. So can you tell us a little bit, based on your experience, you've worked with some of the top agents in the business, can you tell us how someone would go about getting started into a career in this field?
Yeah, it's a great one to start. And Diego, just let me know if I'm too soft, I'm too loud, and yeah, we can go from there. But basically, and the funny story is really that we talked about previously. Initially, that's what I wanted to do as well. I remember at university, if not before, wanted probably to be a sports agent, and that was even during my law degree. I emailed loads of agencies, spoke to lots of people, and it's obviously and still is a very difficult industry to get involved in. I then did an internship actually at what was IMG back in 2002, 2003, and worked in their sports team for a summer, which was fantastic, and that gave me great experience. But ultimately, it's a very tricky and difficult industry to break into. There are certainly a lot more agents and agencies representing a huge draft of players. And ultimately, it comes down to a few things, and we'll talk about it in terms of some FIFA reforms a bit later. But the point being is that in the UK, at least for the FA regulations, if you want to be an intermediary, all you need to do is pay the fee, sign a declaration, and then try and sign some players up and be an agent without too much of an education or agent education or exam required. Now, what usually happens as a result is if you are lucky enough, you can speak to people in the industry, try and gain work experience at particular agencies and move up the ladder that way. But, you know, there are a real finite amount of job opportunities. And usually the best way to be able to at least try and get into the industry, if it may be on-field agency representation, it might be off-field agency representation, like, for example, helping with brand relationships, ambassador deals. It may even be social media and branding related matters. So I think that the great thing that has happened with digital, with the commercial side of sport generally, is it's opened up a lot more opportunities for agents, for people that want to get involved perhaps in the wider sphere, the commercial sphere, which may include also on-field and off-field.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And of course, this has changed because back in the day, people would have to do an exam and do the FIFA exam as it was known back then. But of course, things have evolved and they've changed. And reforms continue to take place. And Daniel, you've alluded to this just recently, but you know, it's been reported that the transfer system is being reviewed by FIFA and that we can anticipate some reforms. And in fact, some of them have already begun to take place. So can you tell us a little bit more about what's happening and what's the situation like as far as the transfer system and how FIFA is regulating it?
Yeah, of course. And the interesting thing, I can talk maybe about 2 or 3 of the interesting points that I think are going to be points to watch out for in the next few months. Ultimately, when I was actually at university back in a while back now, 1999, 2000, when I started, that was the time of the previous FIFA transfer system reforms with the new regulation, with newer regulations coming into fact. And, you know, we're talking now about 2019, almost 20 years on from that process, changes needed and afoot. Now, we talked about agents before. I think one of the most important new reforms is, I guess, what you would call is a re-regulation of agents, which is going to be happening in the coming years, which is, by way of brief background, FIFA a few years ago more or less gave the responsibility for regulating intermediaries or agents to the national associations. And it looks like, or at least FIFA are now coming to terms with the fact that that probably hasn't worked as well as they'd have liked. And what is happening as a result is it looks like hopefully there will be a re-regulation by FIFA, but more importantly as well, and this is an important part, that there will be some type of licensing requirement on the part of agents. So they're going to have to pass an exam. They may need insurance in order to be able to practice. So that, you know, agents are really going to have to be au fait and have a significant amount of expertise and knowledge of the rules and the regulations. And that's just one point. Another aspect is what's called a clearinghouse, really, where I think FIFA have been concerned that a lot of national associations don't quite have the transparent regulations in place to ensure that when transfers are happening, that the monies go into a central place in order for the monies then to be distributed out accordingly, without monies perhaps being not being recorded and effectively being accounted for. I think that's an important element. There's also aspects to do with solidarity and training compensation. A lot of the time, those can be quite significant payments to training clubs and clubs that brought up particular youth development policies and schemes. And some of those clubs lose out on quite significant amounts of money. And I think the other point, which I think has been lost a little bit in the coverage, is the loan system at least looks like it's going to be reformed to a degree, where there may well be limits on the ability of clubs to be able to loan a certain amount of their players out to other clubs. And that effectively is a byproduct of certain clubs taking on huge amounts or significant amounts of players, loaning them across Europe, and then presumably selling them on, or then incorporating them into their squad if they're good enough.
Yeah, this is very interesting and something that I think we'll all keep an eye out, because we've heard about the numerous reforms that are coming into place, but it's always interesting to hear the perspective of an expert like yourself to talk about how this could have an impact moving forward, and seeing how the regulations changed in 2015 and what's coming up now will be interesting to follow. Now, I guess the next question that we'd want to know more about is, we hear a lot in the media, and especially now we're approaching deadline day, we hear a lot about the multi-million transfer deals and, what happens in the media. We see it that certain players move to, the big clubs across Europe. But obviously you work behind the scenes and you've been involved in numerous deals yourself. So can you tell us a little bit, and I know this is something that you uncover in the book that you've just released, Done Deal, but can you tell us a little bit about what goes on behind these multi-million transfer deals? How do they start? How do they get from being a rumor to a reality? I guess we could say that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good it's a really good point. Rumor to reality is exactly right. I think from my perspective, and from the legal side, usually when I start getting involved in deals, they are probably 80% across the line already. Ultimately, a lot of my experience is working with agents and players on the whole, where transfers or renegotiations of contracts are actually happening. So the types of contracts that I am dealing with usually revolve around representation contracts of agents with the players and the clubs to work out how much ultimately agents are going to be paid for the services they're providing. And then also the employment contracts and the particular payment obligations on clubs to pay the players, if it's gross or basic salaries, if it's particular bonuses, if it's image rights contracts, if there are particular release clauses, if there are relegation clauses, quite significant bonus appearance win clause provisions. It can go into quite significant detail, as I sort of mentioned in the book. And ultimately, I think the other thing that I tried to get across in the book in the early chapters about transfer deals is, you see a lot of fans see, let's just say, a £30 million transfer being reported, but actually, based on the transfer agreement, sometimes that can actually not be the correct figure for the actual transfer. It may be that, for example, only 2/3 of that figure, maybe only 20 out of the £30 million, is actually a guaranteed amount that Club A will pay to Club B. The other percentage of that transfer amount may actually be what's called contingent payments, which are if the buying club wins the Champions League or wins its National League or other types of performance-related measures. So what I mean is that the headline figure sometimes actually isn't the actual reported figure in the end. And the same being also for the monies that have to be paid to players as part of the deal. Usually, let's just take a player that's on £100,000 a week. That, in my sort of calculations for a while back that I did, came to around £25 million, £26 million over a 5-year deal. So ultimately, a £30 million transfer may actually equate to more than £50 million worth of liability that will actually be incurred by the club. And sometimes that part isn't quite made as visible as you'd expect.
Yeah, this is very interesting, very, very interesting. And in fact, maybe we can discuss this a little bit more, because how are these salaries structured? I mean, you've touched upon image rights, you've talked about some bonuses. So can you tell us a little bit more as to how the salary of a professional player would actually be structured?
Yeah, ultimately it depends on the club, depends on the negotiation position, depends on the negotiation tactics of the agent as well. But what is tending to happen more and more is that there is a percentage which is guaranteed. So a certain percentage of the salary will be paid regardless of whether the player wins, whether the club is successful, and whether the club reaches particular milestones. What I've seen more and more in contracts is performance-related elements. So you may have a slightly smaller percentage guaranteed wage, but a larger percentage of performance-related success. So if the player appears and the team wins, then you get a larger appearance and win bonus than you otherwise would do if you weren't playing and weren't winning. The same for particular squad bonuses, which won't necessarily be part of the contract itself, but will be part of a separate collectively negotiated deal between usually the club captain and or the club representatives. Just as you said, also for some of the more elite clubs in the Premier League as well, a number of the teams, they'll also have image rights contracts with their players. And some of those image rights contracts can be worth up to 20% of the total package that a player is paid for his on-field and off-field marketability. So that can sometimes be quite a big deal and another separate document to negotiate. So, some people will see the salary as it will always be £100,000 a week, when actually the salary may be £60,000 a week, and £40,000 a week may be dependent if the player plays, if the team wins, and if they meet certain performance criteria as well.
Very interesting. And I guess at this point as well, I mean, the representative and the player himself will want the best deal, whether that's if he earns more money with a certain percentage of image rights, or if it's bigger salary. At the end of the day, they'll look for the best package that fits what's best for them, right? Excellent. Right. Well, then let's move on to the next subject, Daniel. And this is something that's very current, that's in the news. We know about Brexit, and it's coming up at the end of March. So this, of course, has an impact on football in the UK. So can you tell us a little bit about what are the main points that we should look out for as far as the impact that Brexit could have on football in the UK?
Oh, where to start? And in a way, I'm almost, I think like a lot of the UK, we're a little bit sick of Brexit is the truth. I'm willing to explain that I'm a Remainer. I was very much keen on not leaving Europe. My tweets, if anyone follows them, will probably see a similar type of sentiment generally. One of the issues that I was talking with a few people about today actually was something which cropped up relatively recently, because ultimately, and the basic premise is, what if there is a deal or if there isn't a deal come the end of March, effectively free movement, the principle enshrined under the treaties of free movement, will effectively end. Now, if that is the case, that effectively means that every worker, apart from UK and Irish workers, I believe will require some type of work permit to work in the UK. Now, if that is the case, there will need to be a pretty rigid structure in place in order for that to work. At the moment, there is that structure in place for non-EU workers, and there's a work permit regime setting out that a player has to play in a certain amount of games over a 2-year period for his national team, or the club has to pay him a significant amount of money over the average over the Premier League, and a transfer fee that is within a certain percentile of the average also, in order to come into the exceptions criteria. Now, if the work permit regime extends to EU nationals wanting to work in the UK as well, then that is a problem, because not only will there be a huge amount more of bureaucracy, but it may be that a number of European nationals may not actually fulfill that criteria, full stop. The other element also is that I haven't quite got to the bottom to myself. I need to chat to our immigration guys about it, who we have a big immigration team at Sheridan's here, is I wonder whether if there is a no-deal Brexit come the end of March, what happens for an EU national who wants to renegotiate his deal, i.e. extend his employment contract past his current deal. That would presumably require a work permit at least for the extension period. And at present, there are no regulations in place to govern what will happen for an EU national who wants to extend his contract past March, unless someone is going to tell me to the contrary. I'm not aware that that's the case. Now, if that isn't the case, then perhaps the default position is that the current FA work permit regulations apply. Now, that may cause a problem for certain players wanting to extend their contracts, even potentially at elite clubs in the Premier League. So without going off on a tangent, and I'm sure there might be some more questions on these type of topics, there's also issues to do with Article 19, which is the exemption granted for EU nationals between the ages of 16 to 18 that the UK won't be able to take advantage of. And the issues to do with discrimination of an EU national post-Brexit, to be able to put quotas in place. But maybe we could talk about that as well as when the questions and Q&A start arising.
Yeah, interesting. That's going to be something interesting to follow, and I'm sure as we approach the end of March, we'll start hearing more and more about these topics. Now, moving on to a different question, Daniel, and I know in the book you talk about other issues apart from transfers as well. You look at broadcasting rights, you look at the business side of football as a whole. And one of the things that's been in the news, especially surrounding financial fair play, is what is known, or what has been called, the state-backed clubs. And we could talk about, those clubs with foreign ownership like PSG, Man City, and all these allegations about some of the sponsorships that they've had inflated, so to speak, and to do so in order to avoid FFP. So what can you tell us about this? Can you share a little bit of insight?
I think there's a number of things in the general and the specific. I think what I don't want to do is talk about the leaked information that has come out at different times, simply because I don't think it's right to a degree. I think if the information has been hacked, then it's very difficult to see the context of what has actually occurred, been said, or been done. So I don't think it's easy to be able to come to any type of conclusion until actually the right processes and procedures have been put in place. So, for example, UEFA has talked about the fact that I believe that they have been liaising with a number of clubs around some of the issues that have arisen from the Football Leaks element. So there will need to be investigations into those type of elements. Needless to say, I think as a general point, when we're talking about FFP, I think FFP gets a bad rep, is the truth sometimes as well. I am an advocate generally of the system. Is it perfect? Probably not. Has it done a lot of good? I certainly think so. One of the best reports, actually, which I'm sure all your students will always be studying, is the UEFA benchmarking report. And there was a recent report that came out in beginning of January time, I think, and that specifically started talking about how pre-FFP club losses were pretty cataclysmic, really, and off the stratosphere, really. So when you look at the overall trend from over 1.7 billion euros worth of losses come, I think, 12-13 season, to now those losses decreasing by over, I think, 1.5 billion euros over that period, it would appear to me anyway that a lot of clubs are in a lot healthier position than they were a number of years ago. A lot of people also say that FFP hasn't been strong enough, hasn't had enough teeth, and the sanctions imposed haven't been coherent and strong enough. Well, I think a lot of clubs have been banned, sanctioned strongly with fines, squad size reductions, sporting sanctions imposed on registrations, on the amount of monies that can be spent on transfer fees and on salaries too. So I think if the ultimate aim of FFP to a degree has been to improve rationality in club spending, to be able to have greater self-sustainability of club ownership and income and expenditure, then I think there are a lot of positives. There will always be those detractors, and far be it from me to say otherwise, that will say it raises the drawbridge, it doesn't allow new investors to come in and spend what they want. All I can say is, in my experience of, well, as a fan, knowing fans of clubs like in the UK, Portsmouth, like Leeds United, for example, that have been in serious financial peril over the years, I think a lot of those fans would perhaps have preferred, well, not perhaps, they've said to me, they would have not have preferred to have gone through that potential financial meltdown, even though they did achieve quite a lot of success at different times, because these clubs were quite close to going out of business, full stop. And I think, and my experience is, based on the UEFA rules, the Premier League rules, the EFL rules, and a number of other national European jurisdiction rules, the ability for clubs to suddenly be in significant financial dire straits is reduced because of the regulations that have been put in place.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay, excellent. Well, at this stage, what we're going to do is we're going to open up the floor for you guys to ask Daniel some questions. We'll have a brief period of question and answers, so be sure to type them in the chat box. And also, when you type in your question, let us know where you're connecting from. If you're, your particular city or country, we always like to know where you guys are, are connecting from. So as you type your question, let us know where in the world that you're coming from. So we'll have an open Q&A session for a few minutes, and then we're going to talk about Daniel's book, Done Deal, and we're going to tell you how you can purchase this book a little bit later on. But let's get started with the Q&As. So go ahead and type them in the chat box, and in the meantime, Daniel, I'll start looking at some of them. I see there's one here from Josh, and he says, does Daniel think that capping agents' fees is possible from a competition law perspective? Is there an appetite for this? So we've heard a lot about this cap, and particularly after the 2015 regulation. So any thoughts on this?
It's a great first question, and as you know, that was probably one of the points that I didn't mention in the reforms that we talked about previously, only because it was conspicuous by its absence. Now, the previous reforms gave recommendations, 3% recommendations, which were just recommendations and weren't mandatory. Now, the question is whether FIFA is going to impose mandatory commission caps. I would, and has already been the case, I would be shocked if there aren't legal challenges to the capping of commission. And exactly as was said, there are a huge amount of competition issues around the capping of particular fees, either from a Section 102 perspective of abuse of a dominant position, or an agreement between competitors effectively, or undertakings that restrict, distort competition in the particular market. Now, could they be justified under a 1.13 principle, i.e. the exemptions that could apply? Possibly. It hasn't been tested to date, specifically with regard to agents' fees. But I think there's a wider point generally, which is what seems to be the issue surrounding agents being paid a significant amount for transfers, or for brokering a deal. I think the issue seems to be, some people suggest that it means money going out of the game. Well, if I tell you money goes out the game by chairman taking dividends or chief executive taking wages, it's difficult to look at it in isolation. And in the same way as well, there seems to be the issue because it is clubs that are paying the agents sometimes, most of the time, at least in the UK anyway. I almost think one of the points that I believe FIFA was considering at different times is potentially, as is the case in the US, where it's mandated that the player pays his agent. And if that's the case, I wonder, as an open question, whether actually that means that there would be less concern, because actually it is the player that is paying the agent for the services rendered for him or her doing that particular deal.
Right. Okay, excellent. Thank you for the question, Josh. Now, there's a couple of questions coming up, and there's one from Bechara from Hungary and Potsi, and they're about third-party ownership. Now, we've heard a lot about this and how it's been banned, but obviously it was very controversial, and it still is. But what is your opinion about TPO?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is it hasn't been talked about as significantly, obviously, as it had over the past few years because of the ban, the FIFA ban, 18TR basically, and 18bis of the FIFA regulations. 18bis was basically in order to ensure that no one apart from the club had any type of material control over the transfer or employment capabilities of a club, and bis effectively gave the ability to be able for no one apart from the club to hold the economic interest, the economic stake in a football player, effectively. Now, the query that probably continues to a degree based on legal challenges or potential legal challenges is whether the ban is actually proportionate. If the question is whether third-party investment, third-party ownership is so detrimental to the football industry that actually it needs to be have an outright ban. The query was whether actually TPO, TPI could be regulated rather than prohibited. Now, I know that there's a number of clubs, a number in Portugal and Spain, South America, for example, that relied on TPI, TPO as a competitive advantage and to allocate risk accordingly because they didn't have as big a funds and greater funds as other clubs with, for example, that had bigger TV revenues or commercial revenues to be able to use to fund player transfers and player wages. So where are we with TPI, TPO at the moment? I certainly don't foresee FIFA changing its position. It doesn't appear that that's even in the offing at the moment. And that means effectively that there should at least be that there shouldn't rather be any third-party investment deals that still are current or currently in current effect, simply because the prohibition came in a number of years ago, and it was difficult to grant then extensions on the third-party investment agreement between the owners and the clubs and all the players. So I think because all of those documents for international transfers have to be effectively uploaded to the FIFA TMS system, there would be a breach of the rules if any TPO, TPI docs, if they still existed, were actually still in effect because of the ban that occurred a number of years ago.
Okay, very, very interesting. Now, there's another question here from Dale. Dale from Manchester, UCFB, alumni master student. He says he's just bought the done deal, so well done, Dale. I'm sure you're going to be able to get lots of great insight from the book. And he's mentioning here about, we talked about the law regarding loaning of players and potentially changing. Do you think this could lead to more players from the top clubs filtering down the football league via transfer loans? Or do you think clubs will continue to stockpile players with the academy under 23 standards? So another good question.
Yeah, well, firstly, Del, thank you for buying the book. Much appreciated. And a really good question. It's one of the things actually I do talk in the book a bit about, which is whether the loan system is fit for purpose anyway, because in the UK, for example, in the Premier League, a player loaned to a loanee club can't play against his parent club, which effectively makes it easier for the parent against that team because they can't play presumably one of their better players. Now, if one club has a number of loan players out to maybe 5 or 6 teams in the same division, or maybe 2 or 3 or whatever it may be, then that presumably puts that parent club in a beneficial position when they play against those other clubs. But back to your point, if that's the right way of saying it, I can't imagine the FIFA rule change will come in anytime soon. It will have to be phased in over a number of seasons, because I don't think it would be fair to be able to put a restriction on employment contracts that have already been entered into. So I think what would probably happen over a longer term, exactly as the question that was asked, is that there may be restrictions on newer registrations that weren't going to be part of the 25-man named squad, for example, if that's the way that it would work. Now, if particular clubs had a large amount of players that were not within the 25-man named registered squad, then it would be an interesting discussion to have with either the FA, the Premier League, EFL, FIFA, other national associations, how that actually works in practice, because ultimately the players wouldn't be able to be loaned to another club. They wouldn't be playing for their parent club because they wouldn't be on the list, which would leave them in limbo. So something would have to be done about the actual registration, rather than them just being prohibited from being loaned, I think.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you for the question. We also have one here, and you talked about this before, Daniel, but Alex Hettel, he says, following up on the question about agents' fees, for whom is the agent providing a service? Is it for the player, for the releasing club, for the engaging club? And with whom does the agent's contractual relationship, and who is obliged to pay the agent's commission? And if there's more than one party, how high is the risk of conflicting interest? So I know you touched upon this before, but perhaps expanding a little bit for Alex there.
Yeah, it's actually a really good question, because this is one of the hot topics at the moment, really. The basic position, which then gets more complicated, is a player will have a representation contract with his agent. That is the simple approach. Now, I can only speak for deals that I am involved in the UK, but what then usually happens when a transfer or renegotiation of a contract happens is the player, or rather the other way around, the club, as a benefit to the player, will say, if you come to us by way of transfer, or if you renegotiate your contract, as a benefit to you, the player, we, the club, will pay your agent the commission. And as a result, to answer the first part of the question, the way that contractual relationship works is that a tripartite agreement is entered into. Tri simply meaning three parties to the agreement, which means the player, the club, and the agent will enter into an agreement which says and confirms that the club will pay the agent the commission on behalf of the player. And that is the way that then the player doesn't have to pay his agent effectively based on the underlying representation contract. Now, there are tax consequences of doing it that way, and there are more complicated structures where sometimes the player, as a result, the agent will act for the buying club and the player, and in that case, the player has to sign a waiver and saying that he understands the potential conflict of interest, but is still happy to go along with the transfer, even if there is that conflict position. So the relatively basic position, I'm sorry it's taken a few minutes to explain, is usually in UK deals that I'm involved with, the club will pay the agent on the player's behalf.
Right. Okay, great question. There's another question here from Yannick. By the way, there's so many questions in the chat box, which means that everybody wants to get a little bit more information as to the doubts or the clarification that they want to have. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them, but we will try and get to a few more. Yannick Liebman, hey Yannick, nice to see you connecting. Yannick says, talking about financial fair play and multi-million transfer deals, do you think that a concept like a salary cap, such as the one in the US, can be transferred to European football?
Well, I think we could probably have a webinar just on the benefits or otherwise of a salary cap. I'm certainly not the expert in salary caps. In my dealings a little bit with some MLS clubs, I was always really fascinated to see how those type of restrictions apply, and there are always exceptions to the restrictions as well. You know, you can have particular headline players that fall outside of caps. You can have particular redistributed ways of being able to get outside of the cap in particular ways as well. What I believe at least FFP came out of in the beginning was the potential for a type of cap on wages to potentially evolve into something else. And ultimately what happened with FFP was FFP decided and UEFA decided to balance revenues and costs effectively by way of acceptable deviation and break evens. But in terms of a cap, there's lots of difficult and problematic elements to it all. The first being, where would the cap be administered? Would it be administered at FIFA level? Would it be administered at UEFA level? Would it be administered at a national association level or a particular league level? If so, would it have to be consistent across all teams, across leagues? Would it be for certain competitions? What would those levels be? What type of wages would it include? Would it include only basic wages? Would it include bonuses? Would it include particular image rights agreements? And they're just the things off the top of my head, really. And I'm sure there's tons of other considerations to bear in mind. The point generally being is, even from an implementation perspective, I think it would be difficult, but not to say impossible, simply because UEFA have done it with their FFP overarching system, and they had to spend a lot of time doing it. So in summary, I think we could probably have our own session on that, and maybe, Diego, we can do that at some point again. But it's a really tricky, not only substantive points to try and get right in terms of what would fall in and outside of the cap, but also how it would be implemented over what time period as well.
Right. No, very interesting. Very good question, Yannick. Adam Spencer from the US as well. He says, with FIFA looking to review the vetting process for intermediaries, do you think that they will add an educational requirement such as the one that was there before, or some type of test or requirement that they will have?
Yes, so I, without knowing for sure, I would hope so, and I think it is likely is the answer. So in the UK, for example, there was previously, you had to pass an exam really in order to be able to be an FA agent at the time. And I know that that was the case in lots of different jurisdictions too. So I think that's a positive thing in terms of the exam. I also think it's important, if not more so, for constant educational programs to be mandatory, really, because there are always going to be updates. People are always going to forget things. It's always important to update knowledge, to be able to speak with like-minded people about particular scenarios and to gain further understanding about the industry. So my hope is that it is, and that will only benefit the industry at large.
Okay, excellent. So thank you for the question there. So maybe we'll take one more question. And I know, as I said, there's so many questions that probably the best thing is for you guys to look at the book Done Deal, where you'll be able to read the great insight that Daniel shares there. But let's take one final question, and it's coming in from Brian, and he's from Mexico City. He's saying, what do you think about multi-property in football? Is it good for business?
So when you say multi-property, do you mean multi-club ownership? Is that?
I would imagine that he's talking about probably something like maybe Man City's franchising model, or other ownership groups that have different stake across different clubs. Yeah.
And you can see with the sort of well, in terms of, it seems that Red Bull from a few years ago as well with their structures as well. But yes, I can definitely see the significant advantages that can apply. I think, for example, you only need to collate together by way of economies of scale, on-field analytics, coaching best practice, resources, scouting resources from across the world. From a commercial and branding perspective, having one hub to be able to offer a significant number of brands particular global opportunities and global scope must be a fantastic potential opportunity. The same with getting best people on board across a variety of different platforms, opportunities, global networks. So I think if we're talking about on-field, off-field, technical, commercial, you can see why a joined-up approach for a multi multi-purpose, multi-club approach offers, a real attraction to owners that want to try and create a global footprint, to be able to offer best practice across a number of clubs, and also, I guess, ultimately be able to potentially feed players between clubs who may fit the particular model, who may fit the particular skill set for that club too.
Yeah, very interesting question there from Brian. So thank you, Brian. Gracias, all the way to Mexico. So thank you guys for your questions. Like I said, we'd love to get to answer all of them, but unfortunately, due to time constraints, we can't go much further. But what we could recommend you is that you check out Daniel's book, Done Deal. Tell us a little bit about the book, Daniel, because I'm sure a lot of the people that are asking some of the questions here in the chat box tonight would probably benefit by reading your book, because you talk a lot about not just the transfer market, but the business of football, right? So tell us a little bit about what we can expect inside your book.
No, thanks for the opportunity to explain. And I think what I can say is I'm more than happy to do is, after the webinar's finished, if anyone's got any questions they still want to ask, feel free just to tweet me at Football Law, and you can maybe put the details up, Diego, and I'll try and answer as many questions I can over the next 24 hours and try and get back to as many people as possible. But in terms of the book, I mean, ultimately the idea is that I was trying to write a book that maybe my own self 5-10 years ago would have been interested in reading, is the truth. A book that sort of spans, hopefully, some really interesting elements of what lays behind transfers, contract renegotiations, what goes on and what agents actually do, the commercial imperatives in football these days, the takeover of social media and how that is impacting on clubs, players, leagues, teams, the disciplinary aspects of the football industry now, from bans, and giving lots of examples across a number of years of what happens in particular instances, for example Suarez or Terry or Rio Ferdinand and those very high profile cases, to issues around broadcasting rights, because ultimately I think one of the things that hopefully anyone that's read the book or has read it already is my first chapter is about what I call the football ecosystem. And the ecosystem ultimately is where ultimately does the value go in and out of particular stakeholders. So ultimately, and a lot of the way that things work in football is, rights, if it's broadcasting rights or commercial rights, broadcasting companies and or commercial companies paying and buying very lucrative rights that then are sold ultimately on to fans in order to purchase by way of subscriptions. And the last chapter is really all about how that value chain works, from the tender process to how much money entities like Sky, BT and others will pay for EPL and Champions League rights, how those rights are distributed, and then effectively how that money is distributed as well. And if we go back to first principles, it is where the money comes into football and then how it is distributed out, and it is usually to players, managers, executives and agents in that order, really.
That sounds really exciting. We're already promoting it to our community and our student base, because we just see so much value in a book that really unpacks the industry in a very clear manner, as you've done in the book here. The other thing that I would say is take a look at who's endorsing Daniel's book, and if you just look at who's written the foreword, it's Gianluca Vialli, then testimonials such as Guillem Balaguer, of course, one of the most respected journalists, Freddie Ljungberg, Arsenal legend and Swedish international, as well as numerous others that have endorsed Daniel's book and provided really fantastic testimonies. So you can pick it up Amazon, Bloomsbury. Basically, what are the channels, Daniel, if someone wants to get the book?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. It's through the institute like yourself and others that have been great in being able to promote it. I've tried my best to promote as much as possible on Amazon as well, really, just to get the Amazon algorithm working as much as possible. And it's been great, the sort of feedback I've had from people reading it, the feedback I've had from people buying it, etc. It's actually a little bit overwhelming, which is fantastic. We've managed to get it into the #1 best-selling football book on Amazon. It's ranking really highly at the moment, which is great. Long may it continue. But the truth ultimately is, I'm not really measuring the success by numbers alone, if not at all. I think what I'd like to have, which hopefully we can have, is, people just saying, you know what, I learned something that I wasn't aware of before. And so long as that's the case, then hopefully I'm really just providing a little bit of insight to people that want to know more about the industry. And if I can do that, then I think, in my mind, job done.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there you have it. One of the top lawyers in the industry, Daniel, I've known Daniel for a number of years now, and obviously followed his work from many years back. And every time that whether it's a blog, whether it's a video, and of course with this book, there's always value, massive value to his expertise and what he shares. So definitely it's something that we recommend to all of you listening in tonight. As he suggested, you can pick it up on Amazon. Just type "done deal" Daniel Geey, and that'll come up, and you'll get the book delivered to your address, evidently. So that's something that we'd encourage you to check out. The other thing that I wanted to do just briefly before finishing off, one of the things that we do is we provide training courses on the business side of football. And much like Daniel's book, and this is why it's such a nice synergy, because our courses are designed to help those that want to start or advance a career in the football industry. So we have a course on football marketing and management starting next month. And I'll just very briefly talk about this course and how it can fit into Daniel's book, in fact, because the course itself looks at all of the business of football, whether we talk about marketing, sponsorship, player representation, media, events, finance. So the essence of the course is how to generate revenue from a property, from a sports property. What you can expect is, you're going to look at understanding how the industry works from an insider's perspective. You're going to build a network from others that are taking the course from across the world, many who already work in the football industry. And you also benefit from mentorship. So we provide mentorship for those who want to, get into the football industry and understand how to, start as a first step. So that's what the course provides. Here are the modules. I would encourage you to go to sbibarcelona.com, where you can see a little bit more about the course, and you can, find out from the website. And if you're interested, get in touch with our team. We'll provide more information. But essentially, it's looking at the business side of sport, and that's why we recommend Done Deal as well, because it's a good way to start understanding how the business of football works. And if you start with Daniel's book and want to know more, and do a little bit as far as education is concerned, get in touch with our team, because our courses are designed specifically for that. That said, I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for your time tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure dealing with your questions and having them answered. And of course, thanking you, Daniel, for taking time off your busy schedule. I know you're busy with your day job. As far as deadline day is coming up, I know that's a busy period for you too. You're promoting the book, and you're here late night, helping us understand and unpack the football industry a little bit better. So I really want to take time to, number one, thank you. Number two, acknowledge you for the great work. As I mentioned before, we've been following you for a number of years, and the massive value you add, whether it's through a YouTube video or a blog post, or as we've just mentioned before with your book. So really want to acknowledge you for the great work that you do for the community. So thanks again for being here tonight.
Absolute pleasure. And all I can do is just to recommend the courses that you obviously undertake. They're fantastic and highly recommended. And I look forward, hopefully, to being on some more webinars in the future with a lot of your students to be able to talk through some of these more specific elements.
I'm sure there's so much more to talk about and so many questions that have come up. So I'm sure there's going to be demand for a couple more webinars in the near future. And as always, it's a pleasure engaging with you. So thank you for your time tonight, Daniel. Thanks everybody for signing on to this webinar. Look forward to connecting with all of you very soon. And until next time, take care.